There are elements the world talks about loudly: lithium, cobalt, copper. They fit neatly into the vocabulary of green transition, modernity, and a future that can be marketed in conference halls and glossy reports. But there are other elements no one advertises at all. Not because they are rare, but because they don't sell the image of progress. They sell something far more consequential: state power. This is where the real game begins. Not over electric cars or solar panels, but over nuclear reactors, hard currency buffers, and military-industrial capacity. Over the materials that decide who can keep the lights on, who can stabilize a currency when markets panic, and who can build the hardware of deterrence when diplomacy runs out of language. The first of these materials is uranium. Africa holds some of the largest uranium reserves on the planet, and few countries symbolize that story more sharply than Niger. For decades, uranium from Niger's northern regions flowed into Europe's nuclear power stations. France's nuclear model, so often presented as the backbone of European energy sovereignty, rested on deliveries from the Sahel. Niger became a quiet energy hinterland for the West, even as the country itself remained among the poorest on the continent. A nation that powered others while struggling to power itself. But once China began expanding its footprint across Africa, uranium stopped being the exclusive domain of European interests. Beijing started to secure supplies for its own nuclear energy program, an effort that is not a side project, but a pillar of China's broader energy transition and state security. The logic is straightforward. If nuclear energy is going to help stabilize China's grid, reduce coal dependence, and anchor long-term industrial growth, then uranium cannot be left to the whims of an open market or to rival political influence. It must be managed, contracted, and protected. At the same time, another pillar of the uranium equation rose in the south: Namibia. Politically stable, with a mature mining sector and established export channels, Namibia became one of the world's key uranium producers. Chinese companies did not arrive there as opportunistic investors chasing the next commodity boom. They entered as long-horizon players, embedding themselves into projects that were designed to last through cycles, governments, and market turbulence. In Namibia, some of the largest uranium mines came under the management of entities tied to Beijing. This was not a one-off transaction. It was a strategic move in a broader architecture. China securing the fuel that will feed a rapidly expanding fleet of nuclear reactors, built at a pace no other country has matched in modern history. The infrastructure above ground, processing plants, logistics contracts, export corridors, was simply the visible surface. Beneath it lay the deeper rationale. Energy sovereignty is not only about power plants, it begins in the geology of another continent. At that point, Africa ceased to be merely a warehouse for the green transition. It became a reserve base for strategic energy. But uranium is only one layer. The second is gold. Gold does not power batteries. It powers the financial system. It sits in central bank vaults as an anchor of credibility, as a hedge against inflation, as a quiet insurance policy in a world where currencies can lose trust overnight. It is the asset that governments and institutions turn to when everything else feels negotiable. And that is precisely why African gold has always attracted interest that goes far beyond commercial motives. In recent years, one of the crucial nodes in this story has been Sudan. After the collapse of the old regime and the country's descent into political fragmentation, gold became a primary engine of financing for local elites and paramilitary structures. In environments where the formal economy is weak and institutions are contested, control over gold is not just profit. It is leverage, payroll, loyalty, survival. At the same time, Chinese firms and intermediaries began appearing more consistently in the commodity chains surrounding this trade, often not in ways that make headlines and rarely through channels that are fully transparent. Because gold from Africa does not always flow into official markets with clean documentation and predictable routes, it frequently moves through informal corridors, through regional trading hubs, free trade zones, Networks of brokers who can shift a shipment from unaccounted to legally exported by passing it through the right hands in the right jurisdiction. That is what turns gold into a political instrument. A state with access to cheap, steady gold inflows gains more than reserves. It gains a strategic financial cushion, an ability to absorb shocks, to stabilize a currency, to maneuver when sanctions or market pressures tighten. Gold becomes a backdoor into resilience, and resilience, in geopolitics, often matters more than growth. Then comes the darkest layer of this entire structure: strategic metals that feed the military sector. Africa does not supply only energy inputs. It also supplies manganese, nickel, titanium, tantalum, and a range of other elements essential for defense, aerospace, and advanced electronics. Without them, you do not build modern aircraft, missiles, drones, or radar systems. You do not build the high-performance alloys that survive extreme heat and stress. You do not build the components that sit inside precision-guided systems or secure communications hardware. As China expanded its own military-industrial complex, it increasingly began to view Africa not merely as the world's battery warehouse, but as the material foundation of a new military power structure. That shift changes the entire nature of the relationship. When a mineral feeds smartphone production, the stakes are primarily economic. When it feeds weapons production, the stakes become geopolitical. And this is one reason why many African regions rich in strategic metals have drifted into instability. Not always because destabilization was engineered in the classic sense, but because the arrival of money, concessions, and foreign interests often fractures local power structures. Sudden resource value attracts rival claims. It amplifies competition inside elites. It strengthens armed actors who can capture supply routes. It introduces incentives that overwhelm fragile institutions. The pattern repeats with brutal consistency. A deposit is identified, capital arrives, social tensions rise, elites polarize, conflicts erupt over control of revenue. This is not old-style colonialism with governors and flags. It is economic colonization without colonial administration, control through contracts, concessions, and supply chain dependence rather than through direct rule. The language has changed. The logic often has not. The most unsettling part is that Africa's strategic resources are increasingly framed not as instruments of continental development, but as chips in a global rivalry among great powers. Uranium becomes a bargaining card in energy negotiations. Gold becomes a stabilizer in times of crisis. Military-grade metals become fuel for a new arms race, and Africa finds itself again in a position it recognizes from history, at the center of global interests and at the margins of global decision-making. This is where the episode closes the loop on the darker side of the resource empire. Because once we talk about mines, we are no longer talking only about the economy. We are talking about energy, money, and military power, the three pillars of state authority. No mobilization was announced, no recruitment posters appeared, no sirens warned of escalation. And yet, in the early 2020s, one of the largest geopolitical battles of the modern era began to unfold. A battle over who controls the first link in the new global economy, the access point to strategic resources. This is not a war over borders. This is not a war over territory. It is a war over supply chains. On one side stand China's systems, built patiently over 2 decades across Africa, in mines, ports, railways, smelters, refineries, and battery supply networks. On the other stands the West, the United States and the European Union, waking up to a delayed realization that the moment they assumed would arrive later had already happened. The world's sources of future metals were not waiting to be claimed. They were already being allocated. That is the point at which the language of diplomacy changed. Instead of democracy and human rights, policymakers began speaking of supply chain security. Instead of development aid, they began speaking of critical minerals partnerships. Instead of infrastructure investment, they began speaking of diversification of sources. Africa stopped being treated as a peripheral theater of global politics. It became a central battlefield of the 21st century economic contest. China entered that battlefield with an advantage. It already had a network: mines in the Congo, lithium in Zimbabwe, copper in Zambia, graphite in Mozambique, ports on the Indian Ocean, rail lines extending from the interior, processing capacity in Asia, battery manufacturing ecosystems that could absorb raw inputs and turn them into finished strategic goods. It was not just access, it was an integrated circuit. The West, by contrast, had to build almost from scratch. In Washington, new strategies for critical minerals security emerged. In Brussels, the Global Gateway Initiative was promoted as a response to China's Belt and Road. Officially, it was framed around sustainable development, transparent financing, and local jobs. Unofficially, it revolved around one objective: to regain strategic ground in Africa without firing a single bullet. Western capitals also understood something else. They could not win by trying to compete everywhere at once. They could not simply take every mine. They could not suddenly construct rail networks comparable to China's. So they shifted the approach. They focused on critical nodes, ports, transit corridors, export terminals. A new strategy took shape: disrupt China's logistical bloodstream. One of the flagship projects in that strategy became the Lobito Corridor, a rail-linked route designed to connect copper and cobalt regions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Zambia with an Atlantic port in Angola. This was not random geography. Lobito offered a way to bypass East African ports where Chinese influence was often strongest. It offered an alternative export route that could be backed by Western consortia and financial institutions. For African states, it meant an additional option. For China, it signaled a potential threat. Because if the West can secure key nodes, it does not need to control the entire system. It only needs enough leverage to slow flows, reroute them, and bargain from a position of strategic obstruction. The contest over resources becomes, inevitably, a contest over infrastructure. Every new port, railway line, and container terminal becomes part of a geopolitical puzzle. African governments entered a new role. For the first time in decades, many were not merely passive recipients of foreign investment. They became actors capable of playing China against the West, negotiating better terms, diversifying partners, extracting concessions. They could choose. But this choice was never free. A shift in alignment could mean loss of financing. A change of partner could trigger contract renegotiations. Stronger environmental or labor rules could drive investors away. In practice, many states pursued balancing strategies, one foot in Beijing, the other in Brussels and Washington. They signed deals with both. They built parallel export corridors. They cultivated competition among investors. It was a new version of the Cold War, not ideological, not overtly military, but infrastructural and resource-driven. The most ruthless feature of this war is that neither side is fighting for Africa out of altruism. The stakes are energy security, electric vehicle supply chains, military production, and technological dominance. Lithium, cobalt, and copper are the new oil, except, unlike oil, they are far harder to substitute at scale. Without them, there is no energy transition. Without them, there are no grids resilient enough for renewables. Without them, there is no modern army equipped for the emerging battlefield. That is why the stakes are so high. In European factories, battery production lines are mapped out on spreadsheets. In Silicon Valley, new generations of hardware are designed as if raw materials are an infinite background condition. In China, enormous processing plants rise with industrial certainty. And in Africa, someone descends into a mining shaft, often unaware that they are the first link in a global struggle over the future. The contrast is almost grotesque. At climate summits, leaders speak about a green tomorrow. In African mines, workers speak about surviving the next day. One group sees charts of CO2 emissions, the other sees dust settling into lungs. The war over resources rarely looks like war, but its consequences are just as enduring. It reshapes economies, it shifts centers of power, it creates new forms of dependency, and it forces a question that is almost never asked out loud. Will Africa remain merely the battlefield? Or will it become one of the architects of the new order? Because if the continent can compel local processing, technology transfer, and industrial capacity building, then raw materials become tools of emancipation. But if Africa remains only an exporter of concentrates and ore, the great power rivalry will leave behind a familiar landscape. New roads, new mines, new ports, and old inequality. In that sense, this chapter is not the end of the story. It is the point where the world enters a new phase of global competition, a phase in which the winner will not necessarily be the one with the largest army, but the one controlling the longest and most stable supply chain. And Africa stands in the middle of that chain, not as an observer, but as its foundation. When night falls over a mine, the scene can look peaceful. Machines shut down one by one, dust settles slowly, and silence rises over the excavation pits like a curtain. From a distance, it resembles calm. Up close, it is something else. Because under that silence, tension continues to pulse. The tension between what has been taken from the ground and what will never return to it. For centuries, Africa has been described as the continent of the future. Always the future, never the present. Always a promise, rarely a beneficiary. In the colonial era, gold, rubber, and diamonds were exported. In the 20th century, oil and uranium. In the 21st century, lithium, cobalt, copper, graphite, and strategic metals. The names of the materials have changed. The vocabulary of diplomacy has changed. Yet the underlying logic remains, in many places, disturbingly familiar. Today, no one speaks of conquest. They speak of investment. No one speaks of plunder. They speak of partnership. No one speaks of dominance. They speak of supply chains. And yet in too many regions the outcome looks the same. The ground is emptied and wealth flows outward. The most ironic part of the story is that the world is building its green future on Africa's red soil. Electric cars, wind turbines, batteries, grid storage, and data centers are sold as symbols of progress. But their foundation is often a mining economy where there is little greenery, little stability, and very little sense of tomorrow. When Western politicians talk about climate neutrality, they rarely mention villages displaced for new extraction projects. When corporations boast about responsible supply chains, they rarely show the shafts and pits, or the informal labor that keeps them running. When China speaks of South-South cooperation, it rarely emphasizes who controls the final stage of production and who captures the largest share of profit. There are no innocent sides in this story. There are only different levels of power. China built a system, one that begins in African geology and ends in Asian factories and global technology markets. The West is now trying to dismantle or weaken that system by constructing its own corridors. African states are attempting to balance between the two blocks, searching for space in which they can extract value for themselves. But the people living next to the mines, the communities that breathe the dust and lose the land, rarely have a voice in the game. They watch convoys leave their regions day after day. They hear on distant screens that the world is entering an era of green transformation and technological progress. In that sense, Africa has become the foundation of a future it does not yet own. And the deepest question is not whether China will win the resource rivalry against the West. It is not even who controls more mines and ports. The real question is simpler and more brutal. Can Africa break the role of the world's warehouse and become a producer of its own added value? Will lithium remain a concentrate shipped abroad, or become the starting point of local battery factories? Will copper remain export ore, or become the basis of domestic energy networks? Will cobalt remain a commodity, or become the trigger for African technological capacity? Because the future is not determined only by what lies under the ground. It is determined by who controls knowledge, processing, and industrial infrastructure. If Africa does not secure that stage, the story will repeat: new elements, new slogans, new promises, the same result. If it does secure it, the world may witness something it has rarely seen: a continent that stops being a back end and becomes a player. For now, trains still carry ore out, containers still roll toward ports, factories still rise far from extraction sites, and Africa's soil keeps surrendering new layers of its history. Perhaps that soil remembers the most. It remembers who came, promised, and left with full cargo holds. And one day, sooner or later, there will be a moment when it is not the world asking Africa for resources. It will be Africa asking the world what it received in return.